welcome to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Lowres, and the Good Girl Confessional podcast is proudly brought to us by WB40. Women Beyond 40, a great platform for women 40, 50, 60 and beyond who are kicking goals in life. If you want to join us over in our community of brilliant, like-minded women, you can check us out at WB40.com. Before we begin today's podcast, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded. And in our case, it is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Today in the podcast, I am very excited to welcome back to the Good Girl Confessional Tara Moss, a brilliant author, advocate, feminist, Tara wears so many hats, it's really difficult to put them all into one sentence. She is extraordinary. Last time we had her on the podcast, she was talking about her book, The War Widow, and I'm thrilled to welcome her back all the way from Canada to talk about her brand new book, which is the second to The War Widow, and it is called The Ghosts of Paris. If you haven't read this book, I will put up the links in the show notes, and please, I say, rush out and buy it. It is fantastic. It's a really fantastic book. Tara is extraordinary in terms of research when she writes her books. This book is number 14. Please welcome to the confessional, the brilliant and always wonderful Tara Moss. Hello and welcome back to the confessional. Beautiful Tara Moss, how are you?
I'm wonderful today. It's such an honor to chat with you again, Sandy. I had so much fun last time, and it's great to come back and chat The Ghosts of Paris.
Woo! I'm super excited because last time you joined me in the confessional, we talked all things about the beautiful The War Widow. What a gorgeous, incredible book. And today, congratulations on the next book, The Ghosts of Paris. Such an incredible book. I am so thrilled that I have a copy and that I've read this copy. It's beautiful. Congratulations to you.
Oh, thank you. The reviews have been amazing and the readers' feedback, and that means so much to me as an author. This is lucky book number 13 and 14, this Billie Walker series. So having 14 books out, it's like each time it's a kind of creative birth. And it really hasn't completed itself. You haven't really done that birthing process until you're getting that feedback from readers, because I can write the book for a couple of years, be researching it for even longer, can be editing and working with the publishers, getting the cover together and everything. But until people are reading it, it's not real, not truly. And I'm just in that wonderful period at the moment, the kind of the honeymoon period where a book comes out and you're getting all that wonderful reaction to years of work done and basically in isolation.
Oh, so incredible, because last time when we were talking about The War Widow, you were already working on, obviously, The Ghosts of Paris. And I think people forget sometimes how long that process is and the process of getting it published and then it hitting the shelves.
Yeah, it's a long process. For me, on average, it's a book every 2 years. So there's been exceptions. Sometimes it's been like I think 3.5 years is the biggest gap I've had between books. And I have had some books that have come out a year apart. But both of those are kind of rarities. For the most part, it's 2 years. And I never really stop writing. I don't take a 2-year break or something like that. It's just that the process, the cycle of finding that inspiration, researching, writing, and then continuing to research, because I never really stop researching. I didn't do that even before historical fiction was my main genre. I've written in crime and paranormal and nonfiction and historical fiction, and it actually doesn't matter what genre I'm in. I always find a way to go down the research rabbit hole. So now that I'm in the historical fiction realm, it is, I'm like 4 times more obsessed with research. And there's so many fascinating things to learn as well. So that's just a long process. And I think unless you've published a novel, maybe your ideas might be misconceptions really about how work ends up in your hands or on your bookshelf. It is a very long process regardless. But certainly when you pick a genre where you need to have like a character walk into a room and look up at a clock and see the time, and then you have to think, wait a moment, could the clock be there? And what sort of clock is it? Is it a Bakelite clock? Is it the right? Did they have those at that time? You know, the telephone she picked up. There's one character who has a pink telephone in her bedroom, Billie Walker. She's got a pink telephone, and I knew the telephone. I could see the telephone. I could see where it was. And then I had to figure out whether she could actually have more than one line into her apartment, because that was the thing. Could you literally have more than one line into an apartment in Sydney, Australia in 1946 for the war widow? Well, as it turns out, yes, this particular apartment complex, you could have a pink telephone, but it was unusual. But I had to be sure that it was possible. So you can see, even just from that very simple example, all we've had is a character pick up the phone after it rings. You've already got research before anyone even speaks. And that's the world of historical fiction.
And what a beautiful job you have done. I gushed about the War Widow last time you were on, because one of the things we did talk about was the extraordinary amount of research that went into this book. And what I absolutely loved was, that the main character of this book is a fierce, strong, incredible woman, as you say, set in Sydney in 1946. So we're talking, just post-war. And what an extraordinary thing for me to find out when we chatted last time, that there were actually female detectives in that time. And while they might have been rare, they existed, and that you were allowed to do that as a job.
Well, that's right. Women were private investigators during that classic, the hard-boiled era, where we are so used to Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. Women private detectives existed. Like, they existed and practiced. And in terms of looking back to contemporary, to that era, fiction about women private eyes, I've literally found one. Like, I had great difficulty finding any work that came out at that time that was set then, that had women in the lead role. It just seemed to kind of not exist in the genre, which is really peculiar. So, well, it's not surprising, but it is peculiar. I'm sure you'll agree.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, I'm not surprised, but also it's weird, and probably needs to be rewritten a little bit, So in a way, I am subverting the genre of hard-boiled and noir, while using a PI, using that classic period of the 40s for these stories, but using a female central character because they existed. I'm not rewriting history. I'm actually subverting a genre that has left certain people out of the literary history. And that's where I think PI Billie Walker shines, or it's one of the many ways in which she shines. She shines because women like her existed, and we just haven't heard enough about them.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I love that you bring your feminism and your fierce feminism to everything that you do, everything. So you create these extraordinarily strong, female, believable, extraordinary characters. And you show, too, things that they have to overcome. I would imagine in 1946, and that was the other thing, actually, and I got that wrong. So she's not a detective, she's a PI, right? Private investigator, because I think one of the things you did tell me was women were not allowed to be called detectives back in the day, but they could be private investigators.
That's right, Sandy. In fact, there's a conversation that happens in The Ghosts of Paris where this very theme comes up. In fact, no one who was not a public detective, so there was a distinction in Australia between private and public detectives. If you were a public detective, you were a cop, right? You were a detective. They actually didn't let anyone who was a private detective be a detective. They banned the word. So it wasn't only women in that case, that were not allowed to say they were private detectives. Men also couldn't. And so they were called private inquiry agents or private investigators. So that is what our Billie Walker is. Of course, the PI as the private dick, the private eye, all of that, it's the same work, it's the same era, that classic era, but they didn't get to say private detective. And I think that's so interesting because there weren't really any other rules. And I mean that in a literal sense. There were a lot of ex-cons who were working as private investigators in Australia and worldwide for that matter at the time. In fact, it was pretty good training to be either an ex-cop or an ex-convict and go into private investigation work, because you'd already learned the ropes a little about the criminal justice system and kind of how to get things done. And that's one of the real curiosities about the profession. And maybe one of the reasons it got a bad rap in some ways is because there were people who were doing time and coming out and working as private eyes. And if you needed something done, like, they were the ones who could do it for you and would do it for you. So they fulfilled a certain need at the time, and that's still the case today. But there are certainly more regulations today. So the private investigator credentials I have, the Certificate 3, is a requirement in Australia to be a PI. But in 1946 and 47, when these books are set, there was no such criteria. You didn't need any training. You could just hang your shingle out and start. And that's one of the really interesting differences, I think, looking back in the 40s. It was a wild world.
It was a wild world, but really, I guess, when we think about it, might have been one of the reasons that women actually entered the field, right? Because there was so many barriers. There still are, let's face it, but back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, there were so many barriers to women going into what were considered, I guess, male-dominated fields. And I suppose, like, if you didn't need a certificate, and if you, or as you say, all you had to do was put a sign on your door, I can understand why it would lead women to say, oh, I can do that too.
Absolutely. And who are the clients? That's another question. So for Billie Walker, her clients, she would welcome anyone, but it's women who keep knocking on her door. And I think the reality, and certainly what we also see even in the popular fiction, it was often women walking into private investigators' offices because they were in need of a divorce, or they were in need of, like, finding an errant husband, or, these sorts of domestic entanglements were the domain of the private investigator. If a person couldn't solve those things privately, they had to find a private investigator to try to figure it out for them, a professional. And as we know, the marriage laws at the time made it very difficult to get a divorce. You had to prove abandonment or adultery, essentially. There were, very, very few categories for divorce that were accepted by the courts. And unfortunately, a woman could be in a very abusive, violent relationship, and that did not count. Like, shockingly, that did not count. So PI Billie Walker is really, she doesn't like the domestic work, but it is her bread and butter. That's what they still call it. They call it doing a domestic, having a domestic. They call it domestic work and private eye work or marital work. And it is the bread and butter for Billie Walker. And she is very often helping women who actually have no other way to get out of their circumstances than to use a PI. And I don't know if you're like me, but if I was in that situation, it was the 1940s, I'd be knocking on Billie Walker's door. I wouldn't be looking up the grizzled old guy. I'd be like, no, I need to talk to you woman to woman about what's happening, and I need to get out of this for my own safety or happiness, or, whatever the situation was. So Billie Walker, she's in it for her own reasons. She makes some coin, but in another way, she's actually helping the women of Sydney, and they know it.
Yeah, and I love that. So I think that's one of the things that I love about that character. And I should say all of your characters are so three-dimensional. Like, you're so engrossed in them. They feel so real. And part of that is that extraordinary research that you do. Everything from not just what Billie Walker perhaps was wearing, but right down to, her pantyhose and her shoes, or even her gun, by the way. The research into that makes everything feel so real.
Of course, it couldn't be pantyhose
No,
yet,
sorry,
Sandy, because
you're right.
but this is the world of the historical researchers. You go, wait a second, okay, what year? What do they have? And then, of course, they all always stocking tops.
Correct.
At that. They didn't yet have the full pant. It's just when you're describing your character and their day, fashion or garments, or kind of like the way dress works, isn't the only thing involved by a long shot, but you still have to get that right. And you still know that that's going to impact their day. Like in Billie's case, she's constantly tearing stockings because she's ending up in fights and alleys and, like climbing scaffolding and all kinds of other things. I won't get into too much detail, so I don't want to give away things for your readers, but she's a woman of action.
She is.
In a time when it would have looked really strange for her to wear the sort of stuff we wear today when we plan to get super active. Instead, she's going to be in a skirt suit. She's going to be in a dress and a trench coat. And thankfully, the 1940s shoes, she's got her trusty Oxfords. They are actually quite a practical shoe. I do wear those. And you can go into a restaurant and you can run from a bomb. And that is what women needed to do in the 40s. It's like, can I be seen in polite company? Tick. Can I run into a bomb shelter with no notice at all? Tick. That's the shoe I want to wear. So can it make it over cobblestones? That was a part of it. So it's a combination of things we might today find impractical and some things that are actually very practical as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right, in terms of the stockings. I remember, even having conversations with my grandmother about this, about how impractical everything was. Because women were expected in the day to be wearing stockings, but they were really, really difficult to come by during the war and also post-war. So, and I love these stories of when women couldn't have them, they painted lines on the backs of their legs to make it look like they had their stockings on, because it was a bit untoward to go out without them.
Bare legs was a little bit scandalous for the beach only. And I guess that the fashion sort of gradually changed and you started seeing like two-piece outfits with midriff showing. And so there was a little bit of that. It was starting to get a bit more daring. But if you were properly dressed, you wore stockings. And so women would actually put gravy on their legs, which I'm thinking must not have smelled really great. And they would use eyeliner to paint a line up the back of their legs. And in a lot of cases, you needed a girlfriend for this. So women stuck together and helped each other, whether it was putting in pin curls before you went to bed. Sisters or friends would often do this with each other. They'd do each other's hair, pin it up before they went to bed, or, and that would be the wet set for the week. It would last a week or more. And they would, help their friend by drawing the line up the back of the legs. And that was just a part of 1940s life. You didn't have a new outfit every 2 weeks like a lot of people do now, but the things you had to look after, you had to iron, you had to press, and you had to, do your hair in an elaborate way, which, I love vintage and even I don't do on a regular basis because it's so time consuming. And some of the differences in what was kind of considered acceptable in terms of how you presented yourself to the world.
Yeah, it's quite fascinating, isn't it? So as you know, for the Good Girl Confessional, all of my sort of promo photos are me in vintage, wearing vintage with that vintage hairstyle and my favorite beautiful red lipstick. And but it's time consuming and, contrary to popular belief, I sure as hell didn't do that by myself. So, there was a beautiful stylist who did that and a photographer who took those vintage looking photographs. I think, that's the thing. What we forget is in the day, women were doing that on a daily basis. This was an everyday thing because it was, as again, considered not quite right to leave the house unless one's hair was done and unless you were dressed appropriately for the day.
Hey there! When Sandy's not interviewing kick-ass women, she's hanging out with me at Alex the Seal, a podcast about music and nostalgia. I'm Jo Pybus, and each episode, Sandy and I talk about all the songs that got us hooked up, knocked up, and broken up. Do yourself a favour and search Alex the Seal on your podcast app. Love you, Molly!
Appropriately, of course, was depending on what work you did, etc. But I love the changeover as well with Billie from when she's working to when she finds herself, you know, in these expensive sort of places and she suddenly has to dress up for the night. And the way that you transition her into that and her thought process around it is actually really quite beautiful, because you actually take us into the mind of this woman who's kind of like, oh, almost like, what am I going to wear and what's going to be appropriate and what's going to get me the attention I need or I don't need.
Yes. Well, that's right. She has to be very strategic, and she uses clothes strategically. There's a character at one point that she's tailing, Mr. Charles, and he's wearing a yellow sweater vest because that was fashionable at the time. And you're kind of thinking, wow, it makes him a real beacon at night when she's following him. And she's wearing dark blue clothes, which probably would actually raise an eyebrow if she went into a nice restaurant and was eating. They'd be like, is she in mourning? Is she going to a funeral? Like, why is she wearing all these dark clothes? But they suit her for her work of like flitting and moving through the shadows. And we kind of forget how those different outfits actually would have been viewed at the time. The bright yellow sweater vest is not as much of a statement as we think. It was being fashionable. And actually he did want to get noticed by the right people, the people he wanted to be noticed by. And if you read the book, you'll know kind of the story around that. And Billie doesn't want to be noticed, but those things that we find really normal, the dark clothes, that I would wear that outfit, that would get me unwanted negative attention in certain circles in 1947, because it'd be like, what's with this strange woman in mourning in the corner wearing all this dark clothing? So I do think it's important to get those things right and to paint the picture correctly. There's a red coat, a red New Look style coat that features in the book that's actually featured on the cover as well. That's not just a pretty picture, although it is that. It is also New Look. As she's looking out over the Seine, and it does play a, albeit minor, role in the plot. A bright red coat will tend to get you noticed, and it plays into some of the events in the book. So all of the choices that we make, everything that is said, all the things that are done, all those pieces that fit together, we can't kind of leave out the things that do impact people's lives. And so for me, yeah, it includes a red New Look coat as well, right?
And could it be any more beautiful? Actually, look at this. For those, I'll put up a photo of this book anyway. But so for those who aren't watching the video and just listening along, on the cover of The Ghost of Paris, if you've not been lucky enough to see it as yet, is this extraordinarily beautiful woman, you know, who is Billie Walker, and as you say, she's standing in Paris. And she's wearing this extraordinarily beautiful woolen red coat. Like, it's stunning. And you get this sense straight away that it's quite cold in Paris. So actually, while we're on that, because we did have a little chat about this before, tell us about this beautiful model who appears on the book, because she's the epitome of all things Billie Walker. But tell us who she is.
So she goes by Ida von Munster, and you can look her up on Instagram. She's got a lot of followers there, and she has a website as well. She is not only a model, but she is a photographer and artist in her own right. So she creates her own photographs. She does her own looks. She is a vintage aficionado, so she is able to dress and style herself just it precisely to the period. And not only that, but she does the photography herself. So yeah, I'd say it's not just a pretty picture. This is a woman who knows how to put things together. And she's been on the cover of The War Widow as well as The Ghosts of Paris. And I send her the books, and she's amazing and loves Billie Walker, and just makes such a wonderful Billie Walker for this book series. As Billie has that look, and some people at the time, in the novels, they compare a bit to like an Ava Gardner. She's got that dark hair and red lips and kind of wears it parted to the side. And of course, she doesn't really look like Ava Gardner, but she's got that essence from The Killers, if you're aware of the 1946 film. She's got that look, and I love that about Ava from the time. There's a kind of hungriness about her. She's like, she's in perpetual motion. She's this sort of, she's sultry, but she's not waiting for anyone. She's like powering through the world. And Billie has that quality. In fact, it's one of the reasons I gave her the name that I did. Billie Walker. She's in motion. She's a woman of action and a devotee of action, which is one of the lines from The Ghosts of Paris. And she, you could say she's glamorous, sure, but she wears her office space, which has like the wooden table. I'm reaching out to my own wooden table because I have a scarred wooden table I work on. That's actually from the 30s. She's got that scarred wooden table she works on in her office, and the filing cabinets is quite a utilitarian space, and she wears it like a battered trench coat. She's that woman, and she's got her slick of fighting red lipstick, and she goes out into the world and does amazing things and uncovers secrets and war criminals. And I just love her for it. I love her complex mix of qualities.
And listening to you talk about her with such reverence, I think I often wonder, and I'll just ask the question, I suppose, how much of you, Tara, is woven into Billie Walker? Because I see some similarities in terms of someone who is, as you say, perpetually in motion, moving forward, someone who's a fierce feminist, somebody who wants to support other women, and somebody who doesn't want to take no for an answer. Over the years, you've worn many, many hats, right? So how much of you is actually in Billie?
I'm feeling very seen right now, Sandy. I'm feeling very seen. She is her own character and arrived really fully formed into my imagination. But I also feel like we're part of the same girl gang. Like, we have a lot in common, and we do have enough differences that I never feel like I'm writing myself when I write Billie Walker. Like, she's fully formed. And especially after writing Mac Vanderwall, again, another character where I was asked the same type of question, yes, my perspective and experiences in the world heavily influence what I write. So my humanitarian work, my work with UNICEF and with victims of war, my work with refugees, my work in feminist spaces and on anti-sexual violence, all of this informs, of course, the characters, the way they see things, whether they're on the same page as I am or the opposite. The way they exist and how they're written is absolutely influenced by personal experience in the world. But they're also their own people, and Billie's no exception. So she's going to make decisions I would never make and do things I would never do. And I suppose that if I thought of myself as her, or indeed if I thought of Mac Vanderwall as me, which again, that was even perhaps a closer, fit or crossover, if you will, then I think it would limit my ability to be an author with those characters. Like, I would maybe stop myself from doing certain things, like torturing them in particular ways, because you have to create a character you love, and then you have to be very mean to them. they say kill your darlings. I won't necessarily kill them all off, of course. I love a series and I want to have those character arcs, but I am going to make them face severe challenges. And I want to say whoever created me also had the same thing in mind, because I have had many challenges, severe challenges. And that's living. So I guess as an author, you can't hold back. You have to put your characters through things that are as harrowing as real life
Right.
is.
Well, as they say, the strongest metals are born, are forged from the fires, right? And I think, so of course that's, to me, that's who you are as well. And so I guess that's why it's easy to sort of say, there must be part of you in there. And I think, as you say, and rightly so, these are fully formed characters. And I said that really early on in the last podcast, that they feel very three-dimensional. They feel very real. There's just not like two-dimensional stuff going on here. There's just so much detail in these books. So tell us, for those that haven't read the books, and honestly, do yourself a favour. I'll do a Molly Meldrum there. Do yourself a favour, get out and read them. But for those who haven't, tell us a little bit about, obviously we've heard a little bit about Billie Walker, but let's find out how this tough, incredible, gutsy and extraordinarily brave woman who's a PI in Sydney in 1946 ends up travelling the world and going elsewhere. How does it all sort of happen without giving too much away?
Well, if you're familiar with my work, you'll know that I do love travel and I love writing about different destinations. Travel in 1946 and 1947 was a little bit different. So it wasn't like today where you could just jump in a plane and end up in Europe tomorrow after traveling for, 25 hours or whatever. It was tough. So I was like, how do I get her back to Europe where she was working as a war reporter during the war? How do I get her back to Europe so that her personal story as well as her professional story can continue to unfold? Well, the way to do that was to have a wealthy client walk in who was in a very difficult position. And that's where Mrs. Montgomery comes in. She is the catalyst for the Ghosts of Paris. She's that client who, much to the classic scene, walks into the private investigator's office and sets the novel in motion. She has some pressing need to find out what happened with her husband. And in order to do that, because he went overseas, he went to London and Paris, and then dropped off the face of the earth, Billie is asked to go and do that. Of course, Billie goes like, well, I'm in Sydney. You obviously need an investigator in Paris. And she's like, well, you used to live in Paris and I trust you and you're the man for the job. Which I love that kind of phrase because it was something at the time, it would have been a really big compliment. I know you're the man for the job, right? So Billie doesn't get into quibbles about whether she's the best man for the job or otherwise. She ends up taking on that work because it is well paid. And it does give her a somewhat, to her, daunting opportunity to go back and try to further unravel the mystery in her own life, which is what happened to her husband, Jack Rake, who's presumed dead. And as an investigator, you can imagine the lengths she's gone to find out what happened. And she has contacts who were war reporters from the time. So reporters, investigators, photojournalists. She knows people who can help her in that task, and everything has come up with a blank. And now she's facing the prospect of actually being on the ground over there for professional reasons. And she knows full well she's going to have to check things out further. And not only that, but she's going to have to look into Hessman, who featured in the first novel. I won't give too much away, but let's just say she got entangled with the Odessa Nazi smuggling network. If any of you are familiar with World War II and the post-war period, you will know the name Odessa. It's a bit of a watchword in a group. And our Billie, of course, she and Trouble know each other extremely well. There's no reason why the end of the war would end that very natural pairing between Billie Walker and Trouble. So we see her having the opportunity to go to Europe thanks to this client and traveling there via a slightly modified Lancastrian bomber, which is actually how you could travel then. Essentially, the planes that were traveling were mail planes. It was a mail run, and there were a few seats for human passengers. So she goes over on a Lancastrian. That's one of my favorite bits of research, actually, in this one is the full Lancastrian flying experience from 1947. Let's just say you wouldn't be very keen on air travel if you had to go in a converted Lancastrian bomber across the world.
And also, too, I can't even begin to imagine. So my father was in the Air Force, and I actually did fly in like one of those big military planes. It was not a Lancaster, but a big military plane. The noise, I can't even, like, so loud. So right, and very so primitive in comparison to how we fly today, you know.
Yeah,
right.
I'm wearing a gas mask, like an oxygen mask, every time there was like a little bit of altitude, like for days. Very, very difficult travel. So that's just one of the fun. Obviously, she arrives into Europe, and the novel continues to unfold in London and Paris, like dream locations as an author, especially in the post-war period, where we're getting to see, the ravages of war. Like, it's one thing to think on it or to see some of the old black and white footage from that period, but the old war reels and things, the news reels that they would play, but actually to have your characters like moving through that world was just wonderful to write. And each book, and I'm writing a third in the Billie Walker series now, it will be set in 1948. So you'll again get another progressive time, and you'll see the social and cultural changes that are happening as the 1940s, begin to move closer to a close. And that's always just such a pleasure as a writer to be able to go into these rich environments and look at what was happening at the time. So, yeah, 1947, Paris and London, just chef's kiss.
And Paris is one of my most favorite cities in the world. I just have such a romantic attachment to Paris, and in fact, I fell pregnant with my daughter in Paris, and that is why her name is Paris. That's how all that came about. It kind of was meant to be. But to read your really rich, extraordinary descriptions of these cities just really catapulted me back, and then for you to describe them, as you say, post-war, really, really made me think about that. Because even the times I've been to Paris, when I think about like the stories that I've read, and I really quite love the history of Paris as well, but to see, how they defended, parts of Paris, like the Sacre-Cœur, etc., from Nazis and, the war machine was quite extraordinary. So I think you've just so beautifully woven that history into this extraordinary story. I think that's what you do like no other.
Thank you, Sandy. That's a beautiful thing to say, and it's my aim. My aim is to create, first and foremost, an engrossing story and characters that you love and want to spend time with. I love and want to spend time with too. And I think that weaving history through these books is like a privilege, and also just a wonderful way to keep the history alive, to not have people's lives and experiences forgotten. Yes, it's fiction, but there's so much of the real that is felt and experienced in this kind of historical mystery and historical fiction. I love that keeping alive of those stories. And of course, there's family stories that I grew up with that were kept alive by the retelling as well. And I do really value that.
I think because I've seen you speak about that as well, your I think we talked about it actually on the last podcast about your family's history and how it made such an indelible mark to hear those stories. As someone who's passionate about research, I imagine that would spur you on to want to find out more, not just about your own family, but about the other people who lived in that time. And I just think that, God, you're a talent. I mean, what can I say? You really are. It's kind of mind-blowing to think. I mean, I can't begin to imagine how much research goes into just the backstories as well, because one thing I need to point out here, we talk a lot about Billie Walker and she is it. She's extraordinary. But to catapult this story forward, as you said, it's not just the clients who walk into her door, but there are central male characters. And I'll talk about the Ghost of Paris. I don't want to give anything away, but there are central male characters in this book that drive the story forward as well, that motivate her in certain ways, whether that's her work, her personal life, as you said, in trying to unravel the story of her missing husband as well. And those characters that you have written, they're fully formed as well. So it doesn't matter if they're like
Thank you.
smaller, I don't know, I guess I don't want to call them bit characters because they're not, none of them are, but they're fully formed characters in their own right.
Thank you. Yeah, look, it's this mix. I mean, it's not a one-woman show, even though it's Billie Walker. I mean, it kind of could be almost, because she is so, she's got such a rich and interesting role, but she has a rich and interesting role in a world that's peopled by different stories and experiences and people's different agendas and motivations and foibles and strong characteristics as well. And all those flaws and all those motivations and emotions are what make a story better. So the fact that she is immersed in this group, whether it's Alma and Ella, her mom and her mom's lady's maid and their story, whether it's Jack Rake, her missing husband, whether it's Hank Cooper, the detective inspector, whether it's Steady Sam, her beautiful assistant, who's a disabled war vet, whoever these men are, or the men indeed who are involved in the cases, Mr. Charles and Mr. Montgomery, they all have their own stories and they all have made decisions for different reasons. And each of those decisions have to hold up. And when you're a reader, you have to feel like, sure, sometimes they do bad things, but kind of think of like, how did they get here? Like, why are they making those decisions? And actually, I think truly seeing humanity in work, and I try to write this way, can be done or should be done in such a way that you can actually see how a person would get to that stage. You can see why they would do the things they would do. And I'm not going to give away who I'm thinking of right now. There's actually a few of the male characters I'm thinking of when I say that. And indeed some of the female characters as well. How did they get to this stage where, if you were to write a one line about their biography, you go, wow, that's not right. You're not supposed to do that. And then you think, well, wait a second. How did they get there? What extraordinary circumstances led them to this point? And you want to put people in extraordinary circumstances to tell a story, because those are the rich stories. And that's also life. It's like, things are never smooth. Nobody is one-dimensional. There's always a story. Everyone has secrets. Everyone is motivated by different things. And sometimes, the kindest, nicest person will still do some of the worst things. And sometimes they'll make those choices even, again, out of kindness, hurting one person while trying to look after another. Life is messy. And post-war,
I was just going to say that. So, everything you say is true even now, but then to take all of the complexities of who we are, who we become, why we are who we are, what impacts us and what creates us and forges us, and then drop us into an extraordinary circumstance like war, and not just, it was a world war. And I often think about that now in terms of the complexities of our lives, and suddenly we're dropped into a global pandemic, a situation no one could have, was thinking about or saw coming. And yet, it affected us globally. So it takes the human experience and it connects us in a way that we never expected to be connected.
That's right. And those choices, hopefully, when you're reading The Ghosts of Paris or indeed The War Widow, you can see hopefully enough context so those choices make sense. But gosh, it hurts for those characters. It doesn't hurt any less because the context of it means that this sort of thing happened more frequently than it does today, or the circumstances were more extraordinary. It still hurts just as much. And so you have to feel that grief for those characters, or feel that joy, or that sense like, here we are in the moment, we could be dead tomorrow, we could be dead in an hour. Like, what do? Do you go out and have a drink, and do you make love, and do you make mistakes, and what do you do? And people did make extraordinary choices in extraordinary circumstances, and there's a fallout from that. There's a fallout. There's the long shadow of war, and there's the fallout of all of those lives and all of those decisions made. And I hope The Ghosts of Paris, which by now I hope your listeners are getting a sense of what that is. It's the ghosts of those people and experiences and loves and losses. It's those things that don't really let us go, right? Unresolved, particularly those unresolved things that stay there just beyond the present moment and never quite leave us until they've been uncovered and dealt with and resolved. Those grief issues, they're going to hang around, and everyone had them. Everyone had those things. And I just think that post-war period, there's so much more turmoil on a political, social, cultural, and also personal level, physical level, financial level, than a lot of us can relate to today, even in the extraordinary times that we're living.
I think that there are moments in this book that took my breath away. And when you talk about pain and when you talk about grief, as a woman, there are moments, and I won't give anything away on what I'm talking about. Go out and read this book. There are moments in this book as a woman that just my heart ached. It hurts, right? And that you just go, and it's so beautifully written. But I think part of that again comes into the formation of such extraordinary characters, is that we want them to be okay, and we want everything to work out. And in life, sometimes, very often, things don't work out, not in the way that we expect. So there are some extraordinary moments in this book that catch you by surprise, that take your breath away, that you feel so much pain. But there are moments in this book as well, I have to say, where that really do make you smile, that that make you think, oh, that's gorgeous, or whatever. I think that's the human experience that you've brought into it, because she is living a life. Billie Walker is living a life, and as she moves through it, different things are going to happen to her. It's not all going to be sunshine and roses, and especially post-war, I don't think people were expecting to live a life that was sunshine and roses either. It was a tough time.
No, there was no, and I've been thinking on this a little bit lately. There was no Instagram version of life in the sense of actually expecting to live like that. I mean, yes, there was popular culture, and there would be fashion magazines where everything looked really perfect and pretty, but there was a separation between the average personal experience and those things, and there wasn't a sense like, oh, you need to embody that, like an expectation that it's actually going to be like that all the time. Like, things were rough, people were tough, and people still are tough today, but sometimes we can have a different expectation depending on kind of where we're looking and what our influences are. And I've been thinking on that lately, like what the differences would have been in terms of the sense of self, how people saw themselves projected, and what was expected of them. It's complicated and a complicated conversation, and certainly every era is going to be different, not necessarily better or worse, but different. And I think that people living through this period had some times where they just really didn't know if they were going to make it through the week, in a way that maybe I hope most of you aren't experiencing right now. I know for a lot of us, COVID has been very scary and continues to be for many of us, even with all the wonderful, changes with treatment and things like that. It's still quite scary for a lot of people. But then we're looking back at this post-war period and thinking of the number of people who had bombs falling and things smashed to literal pieces around them. Just the mass destruction of that is hard for most people, say, in the West to relate to. And when we watch the scenes from Ukraine or something like that, it's a reminder that actually war has been around a lot and doesn't really leave people alone, which is very unjust. But we haven't been living in the midst of it, and these people were. And I think that we can take some lessons from them and with their resilience. And that's one thing I love about
absolutely. And my very British grandmother, who's no longer with us, but telling me stories of she, obviously in London, living in London, bombs happening, half their house fell down. So the house next to them, the two houses are adjoining, the house next door goes completely, and they're just looking out on the top story with nothing. Like, there's no wall, of running to bomb shelters, of making a really difficult decision to send her children off to Australia. Like, many children were shipped off to Australia because it wasn't safe for them to be in London. All of those things. I just and then to become a mother, myself, and think about that extraordinary choice and the hardness of that. But I think what also is fascinating is, my aunt would go on to write her story, and I think her time of being shipped out to Australia without her mother, and to hear, what I mean, to kind of get a sense of both sides of that story. So difficult because there was so much PTSD, so much trauma, but so much not really understood about that, and about mental health issues, and about all of those things. So these people they got through their life in the very best way that they could, not armed with, help and support in a way that we can access today, or most of us can access today.
That's right. In The War Widow, there's a mention of, someone that Sam is friends with as a returned soldier who's got shell shock, and his wife doesn't like him driving the car, because he's, not well, but they didn't have the term PTSD back then. And so some people are a bit shell shocked, and it's, there's also mentions of that in this book as well. And that also plays into Billie Walker's role when she's helping women escape abusive relationships, because that untreated PTSD and returning from conflict and violence, some of that violence spilled over into people's private homes, with these guys not having help, and women not having help, their wives not having help or escape. And like I said, it wasn't grounds for divorce at that time. So it was incredibly difficult for a lot of people, and it was mostly dealt with in silence, which, as we know now, is incredibly unhealthy. But yeah, people worked through incredible things, and there was a sense of day to day, things just standing on a knife's edge. Talking about this really difficult experience in your family with the house being bombed. There's a story that comes to mind of my Dutch relatives or ancestors in Numansdorp, and there was a bomb that fell through the top of the house and didn't go off. And just this massive bomb just sitting there suspended in the roof, but it didn't go off. And so they lived to continue through the war. Or my Opa, escaping the Nazis from a work camp, under extraordinary circumstances, and using his own wits to be able to do that, and the help of my Oma. So just the way people dealt with things with that, just imagine that, living in a time where a bomb could fall into your roof and it didn't go off.
Yeah,
So
wow. It's
on you go.
I know, right? We could be talking about this all day. I
Keep
mean,
going.
I was thinking about, my grandfather in Australia who went off to Papua New Guinea and came back really, as you say, what they termed shell shock. He suffered with that for the rest of his life, and he was never, the same man again. And so my mum telling me stories of her dad who was fun and gentle and this really lovely man, and then a car would backfire or something would happen, and he was quite traumatized. And so he was a man who rarely, if ever, talked about the war, and who held those memories so close, and was quite traumatized. And I think later on, suffered with dementia. And you could see even then trapped in all this trauma, which was really quite awful and sad. I think it was true for so many people, as you say. One of the beautiful characters in this book I'd like to quickly just have a chat about is, of course, beautiful Sam, who what a sensationally beautiful character is Sam. What I love about Sam, I love many things about Sam, but what I really like the relationship between Billie and Sam through both of these books. For Billie to have an assistant who happens to be a man, was genius. And as you said in our last chat about the war, it would have actually been quite common, because while women were being PIs, there weren't enough of them where they would have a female assistant or associate perhaps. So I love the character of Sam, and I love how he comes in. And as you touched on before, he's come back from the war with a disability and traumatized, and his own sort of secrets and his own, stories he doesn't want to tell, I guess. And their relationship evolves so beautifully from the war widow through the Ghost of Paris, the trust, the friendship and the genuine love for one another, I think, really comes through. He's such an extraordinary character. How did that come about? How did Sam come about?
Well, he looks a bit like Alan Ladd, but much bigger. And I always talk about him being a few axe handles across, right? Like, I wanted that combination. I wanted to be able to see him in my mind and see him in the 40s, and which is why I made him look a little bit like Alan Ladd, because that would have been a kind of reference point at the time, just like Ava Gardner was. Of course, these characters don't look like them, but it's a reference point. It's also, if someone from the outside from the time was looking at them, that's the kind of comparison they'd give, because those were the pop culture, faces, right? So you've got this man who's returned from the war. An Italian thermos bomb has taken off some of his fingers. Both hands have been injured, but his right hand works quite well, and his left, he's got this prosthetic wooden fingers in this leather glove. The army has no use for him anymore, and that is one of those brutal realities. So, thanks for your service. Be on your way. And so it was very realistic, in fact, that he would end up working for Billie. I've had not very many, but one male reviewer who found it just like really irksome that she would have a good looking male assistant. And I was like, if you were listening, I got my hands in the air, like, suck it up, dude.
Yeah.
She can have a male assistant, thanks, and particularly a returned war vet who's disabled, and there was not much work around. He would have been very happy, thank you very much, to have that job. And as Billie sort of says in the book, she says, he's happy to take orders from a woman, which is far too infrequent among guys, right? So he's the genuine article. And we also see that with John, the lift attendant who appears in Ghost of Paris as well, another return vet, again with physical changes and disabilities that have come through his service. So Sam is an authentic character, and so is Billie. But occasionally, guys who love themselves some hard boiled are like, "No, I can't take that. There's this woman who has a good-looking assistant. Hilarious, the good-looking secretary. I'm sorry, but he's good on the eyes, and he's a bit younger than Billie, and he just, he has a great deal of respect for her, and there's a lot of affection between them, which I really like. So I wanted to create a realistic partnership. And yeah, I did want to subvert the norms. It's not hard because the norm is pretty rigid. The norm is like so one-dimensional. And I can say that with great love for the genre because I'm writing, you can call this historical fiction, you can call it noir, you can call it hard-boiled, you can call it mystery. I don't really care what genre you call it, but you can tell what it is when you're reading. If you love any of those elements of any of those stories, that's what the wheelhouse, if you will, of these stories. And those scenarios, those offices, when they're written, it is a very narrow sort of norm. Breaking out of that is a joy, and Sam helps us to do that. And Sam and Billie make an incredible pair. And I love one of the kind of internal comments she makes in chapter 1, I think, about how Sam he understands strategic invisibility. Despite his size, he knows how to not take over a room because Billie's going to have these perhaps vulnerable, perhaps skittish, perhaps fearful clients come into her office who are not having their best day. You don't go into a private investigator's office when your life's going well, right? Going to come into that office and need to be reassured, and he can't be throwing his weight around, particularly perhaps because it's more than likely the reason that woman is in there is because of a man in her life. And so he needs that strategic invisibility, and he's very good at it. And that can happen simultaneously with a character who she has seen, and again, this is another one of her things she observes, she's seen him throw a man, across an alley with his good hand, right? And that's like, that's a wonderful series of characteristics. So I think that says a lot about Sam. He can get the job done. He's a great person in your corner when things go sideways. But he also is respectful of Billie's position as the principal investigator and his boss. And he does not throw his weight around in those situations. He'll throw the bad guy around if you need it. You got a bad guy needs throwing. Sam is your man, but his strategic visibility is well honed as well. And I just think we also get a sense of that when they're traveling in the Lancastrian as well. This sense of like, here's a guy who actually respects what Billie is, who she is, but also what she is doing, and that. I think as a reader,
so refreshing. And the other thing that is really beautiful is his willingness to learn from her. So not just a respect because she's his boss and she pays him, not just a respect because she actually is really great at what she does, but also too that his willingness to learn from her. And that he's, you get this real sense that he's watching everything that she does and taking it in and learning and understanding the intricacies of that role and that job and why
that's right. He is new to the work comparative to, she's grown up with a father who's a PI. She's the principal investigator. This is her agency and her work, but he's as her sidekick and assistant, helping and learning. Like you said, he's not the type of person who's then going, well, obviously I'm going to be better at this because I'm a guy. No, he totally sees what she's bringing to it and tries to complement what she's
and the
doing.
Beautiful,
in her work,
I think,
rather than
humanity within their relationship. Oh, anyway, I don't want to give too much more away, but I will say I defy anyone to read the book and not love Sam. We do love him. And I defy anyone to who reads these books to not have a sense of awe and wonder about Billie Walker and about, you know, everything that you have created in these books. I'm super thrilled to hear that there's a third coming, and loving that it's 1948. That's, yeah, wow. I think it's you know, when I think 1948, I'm thinking about my grandmother's having children of her own at this point in time. It's very different kind of world as people were sort of moving into the 50s, I guess. And yeah, I'm super excited to read the next one, and I can't wait to find out what adventures and, as you say, trouble Billie Walker finds herself in. Oh, yeah,
Her in
trouble will have a love affair, that's for sure. I'm so thrilled that you could join me here today. I just love chatting with you. I think I could chat with you for hours and hours. And I'm sure there will be more opportunities to chat down the road. Thank you so much. And just as I say, we will put up all the links to you and where people can follow you and your extraordinary books. And as you say, this is book 13 and 14, is that right, of your incredible work. And for those who may not be familiar, I don't know anyone who might not be familiar with your work, if I'm honest, who listens to the podcast. But if they are not, you, as you say, have written many things across many genres, non-fiction, fiction, crime, you name it. It's feminist, books on feminism. I mean, just jump in. There is something there for everyone. But these are really genuinely beautiful books with incredible, beautiful feminist overtones, I'm going to say. And I love them, and I salute you.
Thank you, Sandy. I salute you straight back as my old Navy League salute, because I was a cadet at one. So yes, fingertips to the eyebrow is how we did it at the time. I salute you right back. And thank you for supporting me and supporting this work and supporting Billie Walker and books with central female kicking ass in a serious way characters. Because I think we need lots of those, and maybe even more of them, so that my daughter, when she gets to be our age, has no trouble seeing women in those central characters as a norm, not the exception that everybody goes, yeah, well, what about Kill Bill? There was that one movie. No, I want to see it as normalized as possible. And it's one of the reasons I write. So thank you for supporting that. I appreciate it, and appreciate all your thoughtful.
Thank you. And as a mother of a 24-year-old daughter, I'm incredibly grateful for you and your work, you know, in feminist spaces, and, you know, your work in supporting people, you know, in very humane and extraordinary ways. And I'm grateful for that, because if there were more writers like your good self, you know, if there were writers when we were growing up like you, what a difference in the world, you know, there would have been. And I think I'm so grateful that my daughter has an opportunity to read your work and people like you. And my son is getting married actually this year, and his beautiful soon to be wife to be is such a huge fan of yours. Like, she's an incredible fan of you, and I think that is what she's most attracted to, is those beautiful, fierce, strong, feminist characters. How beautiful that women, you know, in their 20s and 30s now, are, you know, can have ready access to such beautiful characters. Aren't we lucky?
Thank you. Yeah, I love it. And, you know, want to give a shout out to some of the women writers who had central female characters when I was growing up. They were so outnumbered. Like, there were so few, you know, it was like, here's Vi Warshawski and Kay Scarpetta, and is there anyone else out there? Like, it was, you know, they're just, you really had to go out of your way. And that's still the case in a lot of bookshops.
And I remember, like, you know, reading Sylvia Plath, and I remember reading, you know, Gloria Steinem, and I remember, you know, all these things that And I was very lucky, I guess, growing up in the 70s to have a feminist mother who was really like waving the flag in terms of that. I say that. And then she was, there was such a dichotomy. She was also wearing crochet heart bras and cooking my dad breakfast every morning, right? But
it was part of a change. It was part of a change. And, no change happens overnight. And also,
it was her
cooking
choice.
Breakfast for him every morning was the perfect thing. I don't know. That's right. That's right. And how wonderful. So I think the complexity of lives and that movement forward, it's never a straight line. And I just love that the choices are becoming more and more available, but actually I'm living in Canada and just a few hours that way is a border to a country where they're right now one of the major parties has just been voting against birth control.
We're watching that in Australia as well.
There's a lot to talk about there.
Really, with a state of horror. Anyway, that's a whole other discussion because we could talk about that for about 5 hours, I think, and longer. Not a straight line.
That's all I'll say. Not a straight line. And sometimes looking at history.
No, I agree. I absolutely agree. I mean, things, reading, The Handmaid's Tale in the 80s and then thinking, now it's a popular television series, obviously, but people saying, oh, it's just a show that could never happen. And you go, Margaret Atwood was right. She never wrote anything in that book that hadn't already happened to women around the world. And I think that's what people need to remember. And you're right. Let's keep our eyes open. In the meantime, go out, buy this beautiful book. It's gorgeous. And follow Tara Moss. You are incredible. I'm so, so grateful for your time. Thank you so, so much.
Thanks for listening to the Good Girl Confessional podcast. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is brought to you by WB40, Women Beyond 40 magazine, available now at WB40.com. The Good Girl Confessional podcast is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and wherever you listen to quality podcasts. We're also now available on YouTube. We chat with really interesting women about their hard-won wisdom, but it really helps us if you can subscribe, like, and share the podcast. Thanks so much for your support. Bye for now.